The one thing I never expected to hear from my best friend in the middle of a lost forest was, "There is something I have been carrying much longer than this backpack." At the time, I thought Mason Walker was talking about the heavy gear on his shoulders. I had no idea those words were hiding a secret that would change the way I saw our entire friendship. Mason and I had known each other for almost 10 years. We met during our first year of college, became roommates for a short time, and somehow turned a simple friendship into the kind of connection where we could understand each other without saying much. He was the person I called after a difficult day, the person who remembered small details about my life, and the person who always showed up when I needed someone beside me. I was Ethan Brooks, someone who loved quiet places, long walks, and moments where the world felt a little slower. Mason was different. He loved adventure, exploring new places, and convincing me to step outside my comfort zone. That was how we ended up planning a weekend hiking trip through a national forest outside Seattle. It was supposed to be simple. 2 friends, 2 backpacks, a trail map, and a few days away from busy schedules. We joked that the biggest challenge would be deciding who would complain first about carrying too much gear. Mason laughed when I packed an extra jacket, 3 snacks, and a portable charger. "You are preparing for a camping trip, not moving into the woods," he teased. I smiled and replied, "And you are the reason I have to prepare for everything." The morning started perfectly. The air was cool, the trees stretched endlessly above us, and the trail looked exactly like the pictures we had seen online. We walked for hours, talking about old memories, future plans, and random stories from our college days. It felt easy, like every other conversation we had shared over the years. Then, sometime after lunch, the weather changed. A thick layer of fog moved between the trees, covering the familiar signs along the trail. We stopped and checked the map, trying to figure out where we had taken the wrong turn. Mason stayed calm, studying the area carefully while I looked around at the endless rows of trees surrounding us. My phone showed no signal. The trail marker we expected to find was nowhere in sight. For the first time that day, the reality became clear. We were lost. Surprisingly, I was not afraid. Maybe it was because Mason was standing beside me, calmly organizing our supplies and making a plan. He always had a way of making difficult moments feel manageable. As the sun started to disappear behind the trees, we found a safe place to rest near a small stream. We shared food, checked our supplies, and laughed about how our relaxing weekend had become much more memorable than expected. Later, while we sat quietly beneath the stars, Mason looked into the distance with a thoughtful expression. That was when he said those words. "There is something I have been carrying much longer than this backpack." I turned toward him, curious about what he meant. Mason looked like he wanted to say more, but he only smiled and added, "Maybe I will tell you when we find our way out." I laughed, thinking it was just another mysterious joke from my oldest friend. I had no idea that the secret he was carrying was something he had protected for years, and that this unexpected journey through the woods would finally bring the truth into the open. The next morning arrived with cool mountain air, quiet birdsong, and a gentle layer of sunlight breaking through the trees. For a few peaceful seconds, it almost felt as though we were simply enjoying another camping trip instead of trying to find our way back to civilization. Mason was already awake when I opened my eyes. He sat beside the small campfire we had safely maintained through the night, carefully studying our paper map while holding a compass in his other hand. He looked up and smiled the moment he noticed I was awake. "Good morning," he said. "I made coffee. It is not great, but it is still coffee." I accepted the steaming cup and laughed. "Right now, this might be the best coffee I have ever tasted." Mason folded the map and pointed toward a narrow valley beyond the trees. "I think the stream we found yesterday eventually connects with a larger river. If we follow the water carefully, we have a much better chance of reaching a marked trail." His voice remained calm, steady, and reassuring. That was one of the reasons I had always trusted him. Even when circumstances became uncertain, Mason somehow made every situation feel manageable. We packed our supplies, carefully checked that we left our campsite exactly as we had found it, and began following the gentle sound of running water. The forest was breathtaking. Tall evergreen trees stretched endlessly above us while sunlight filtered through the branches in long golden beams. Small birds darted between the leaves, and the cool breeze carried the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. Under different circumstances, I would have happily spent hours enjoying every moment. Instead, we focused on moving carefully while keeping track of landmarks and conserving our energy. Every so often Mason would stop to compare the compass with the direction of the stream before continuing forward. Around midday we reached a fallen tree blocking part of our path. Without saying anything, Mason crossed first, then turned around and offered me his hand to make the crossing easier. It was such a familiar gesture that I accepted it without thinking. He had been doing little things like that for years, carrying the heavier backpack whenever my shoulders became tired, quietly giving me the last bottle of water on long road trips, walking on the outside of busy sidewalks without ever mentioning it. I had always viewed those actions as the habits of an exceptionally loyal friend. Now, after hearing his mysterious words the night before, I found myself wondering whether they meant something more. We stopped for lunch beside the stream and shared sandwiches we had packed before leaving home. Mason noticed I was unusually quiet. "You are thinking about something," he said with a knowing smile. "You always tap your fingers against your water bottle when your mind is busy." I looked down and realized he was right. "You notice everything, do you not?" He shrugged modestly. "Only the things that matter." His answer lingered in my thoughts long after we resumed walking. During the afternoon we laughed about old college memories, including the time we accidentally signed up for the same public speaking class and spent an entire semester encouraging each other through presentations we both secretly dreaded. Mason remembered details I had completely forgotten, including the blue notebook I carried everywhere and the lucky pen I refused to replace. I smiled as he told the stories, but another realization quietly settled into my heart. Every happy memory I treasured somehow included him. As the sun slowly began moving lower across the sky, we still had not found a marked trail, yet I noticed something surprising. Although we remained lost in the forest, I no longer felt unsettled. Walking beside Mason felt strangely familiar, almost comforting, as though the uncertainty around us mattered less simply because we were facing it together. Without realizing it, I had begun paying less attention to finding the quickest way home and more attention to the person who had quietly walked beside me through nearly every important chapter of my life. That evening we decided not to keep walking after sunset. The forest had already taught us that rushing through unfamiliar terrain only created more problems. So we chose a small clearing beside the gently flowing stream where the ground was level and surrounded by tall evergreens that offered shelter from the cool evening breeze. Mason gathered fallen branches while I prepared our small camping stove, and before long the comforting glow of a modest campfire pushed away the growing darkness. The peaceful sound of water flowing over smooth rocks mixed with the quiet chorus of insects, creating a calm that felt almost unreal after everything we had experienced. We heated soup, shared the last of our fresh fruit, and sat side by side watching tiny sparks rise into the clear night sky. For the first time since we realized we were lost, neither of us talked about maps, trails, or finding our way out. Instead, the conversation naturally drifted toward memories we had not revisited in years. Mason smiled as he stared into the fire. "Do you remember the first week we met?" he asked. I laughed immediately. "You mean when you offered to help me carry my boxes into the dorm, and then dropped one because you insisted you could carry two at once?" Mason placed a hand over his heart with exaggerated offense. "I prefer to remember that as an enthusiastic demonstration of confidence." I smiled. It was confidence. The coordination came later. We both laughed, and the familiar ease between us made the forest feel far less intimidating. As the conversation continued, one memory after another surfaced naturally. We remembered late-night study sessions fueled by inexpensive coffee, spontaneous road trips after final exams, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes that never looked quite right, and countless ordinary afternoons that somehow became unforgettable simply because we spent them together. What surprised me most was not the memories themselves, but the details Mason remembered. He recalled the exact song playing during our first road trip, the encouraging words I needed before my first job interview, and the tiny bookstore where I found my favorite childhood novel again after believing it had gone out of print. I looked at him with quiet curiosity. How do you remember all of that? Mason shrugged gently. Some moments are worth holding on to. His answer sounded simple, yet it carried a depth I had never noticed before. As the fire burned lower, I found myself thinking about my own memories. Every major milestone in my adult life seemed to include Mason standing somewhere nearby. When my grandfather passed away, Mason drove 3 hours without being asked just to sit beside me. When I celebrated my first professional success, he was the first person waiting outside my office with coffee and congratulations. When I doubted myself, he somehow always knew exactly what to say. I had always described him as my best friend because no other phrase seemed large enough to explain what he meant to me. Sitting beside the campfire, I quietly wondered whether I had misunderstood those feelings all along. The stars gradually filled the sky above the towering trees, brighter than I had ever seen them in the city. Mason looked upward and smiled peacefully. Funny, is not it? He said. We spent years rushing through life, and it took getting lost for us to slow down long enough to actually notice everything around us. I followed his gaze toward the endless stars. Maybe that is not the only thing we have finally started noticing, I replied without fully understanding why those words felt so important. Mason looked at me for a brief moment before offering a quiet smile that seemed to hold far more meaning than either of us was ready to explain. The fire continued to glow softly between us, and although neither of us spoke again for several minutes, the comfortable silence somehow said more than any conversation we had shared before. The fourth night in the forest felt different from the ones before it. The first night had been filled with uncertainty, the second with careful planning, and the third with memories that reminded me how much history Mason and I shared. But that night, something between us had quietly shifted. We were no longer just two friends trying to solve a problem together. We were two people finally paying attention to everything we had overlooked for years. The morning arrived with a soft layer of mist covering the trees. Mason prepared breakfast while I studied the map again, trying to recognize any landmarks that could lead us back to the main trail. He noticed my expression and smiled. You are doing that thing again. I looked up. What thing? The thing where you try to solve every possible problem before it happens. I laughed because he was right. Someone has to think ahead. Mason handed me a cup of coffee. And someone has to remind you that not every moment needs a perfect plan. His words stayed with me as we continued walking. The forest was quiet, but it no longer felt unfamiliar. We followed the stream through a narrow path surrounded by tall trees and colorful wildflowers. Every few minutes, Mason pointed out small details he noticed along the way. A unique tree shape, a certain type of bird sound, a familiar pattern on the rocks near the water. I realized that Mason had always been someone who truly noticed the world around him. Maybe that was why he noticed me so easily too. Around midday, we stopped near a small clearing to rest. The sunlight reached the ground through the branches above us, creating a peaceful place that felt almost hidden from the rest of the world. While we shared our remaining snacks, Mason became unusually quiet. I looked at him carefully. You have been wanting to say something since yesterday, have you not? For a moment he looked surprised. Then he smiled softly. You always know when something is bothering me. I shrugged. You do the same thing when I am hiding something. Mason looked down at the ground, turning the compass slowly in his hand. Maybe that is because we have known each other for so long. I waited, but he did not continue immediately. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence only two people with years of trust could share. Finally, Mason spoke. Have you ever wondered why I always show up when you need someone? I smiled slightly. Because you are my best friend. He nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. Yes, I am your best friend. The way he said those words made me realize there was something more behind them. He looked toward the trees before continuing. But sometimes being your best friend has been harder than I expected. I felt my curiosity grow. What do you mean? Mason took a slow breath. I mean, there have been moments when I wanted to tell you something, but I was afraid that saying it would change everything. The wind moved gently through the branches above us. For the first time since we entered the forest, I felt like the biggest mystery was not finding our way back. It was understanding what Mason had been carrying for so long. Before I could ask another question, a distant sound caught our attention. Somewhere beyond the trees, we heard what sounded like movement near a possible trail. We quickly gathered our supplies, hopeful that we were finally getting closer to finding our way out. Yet, as we walked forward together, I could not stop thinking about Mason's unfinished sentence. Whatever he had been afraid to say, I knew one thing for certain. It was something he had carried far longer than this journey through the woods. The sound beyond the trees grew clearer as Mason and I continued walking, following what we hoped was a sign of a nearby trail. Every step felt lighter because we finally had a direction again, but my mind was still focused on the words Mason had almost said earlier. I had known him for nearly 10 years, and somehow I had never noticed how many things he kept hidden behind his calm smile. When we reached a small open area, we found signs that other hikers had passed through recently. A few faded trail markers were attached to nearby trees, confirming that we were moving closer to a familiar route. Relief washed over both of us, but instead of immediately celebrating, Mason sat down on a fallen log and looked unusually thoughtful. "We are almost out," he said quietly. I nodded. "That is good news, right?" He smiled, but it was not the same confident smile he usually wore. "It is. I just keep thinking that once we leave this forest, everything goes back to normal." I looked at him carefully. Maybe normal is not always the best thing. Mason seemed surprised by my answer. The truth was, the last few days had changed something inside me. Being away from distractions had made me notice the small things I had ignored for years. I noticed how Mason always walked slightly slower so we could stay together. I noticed how he checked the map more often when he thought I was tired. I noticed how every decision he made naturally included me. Before this trip, I had considered those things simple friendship. Now I was no longer certain. We rested there for a while as the afternoon light moved between the trees. Mason looked at the compass in his hand and smiled faintly. "Do you remember when we first met?" he asked. I laughed. "You mean when you thought you could teach me everything about hiking, even though I had never been on a real trail before?" "I was trying to help," he replied. "You were trying to impress me," I teased. Mason laughed, but then his expression became softer. Maybe I was. The honesty in his voice caught my attention. For a moment, neither of us looked away. Then Mason lowered his eyes. "Ethan, there is something I should have told you a long time ago." My heart started beating faster, not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly understood that this conversation had been waiting for years. The forest around us became completely quiet. The distant sound of birds, the movement of leaves, and the gentle breeze all seemed to disappear into the background. "What is it?" I asked. Mason took a deep breath. "I have spent a long time trying to convince myself that what I feel is just friendship. I told myself that because you are my best friend, because our friendship matters so much, and because I was afraid of changing something that means everything to me." I stayed silent, giving him the space to continue. "But the truth is, I have cared about you in a way that goes beyond friendship for a very long time." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of hidden emotion. Mason looked nervous for the first time since I had known him. "I never wanted you to feel pressured. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable. I just needed you to know because after everything we have been through, hiding it started feeling harder than being honest." I looked at the person sitting beside me, the same person who had shared countless memories, supported me through difficult moments, and somehow always made ordinary days better. The confession I had expected to feel shocking instead felt strangely familiar, as if some part of me had already known the answer before Mason ever said it. The forest had not only brought us away from everything familiar, it had brought us to the one conversation we had both been avoiding for years. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. The forest remained perfectly still around us, as though even the wind had decided to give Mason's words the space they deserved. I looked at him and saw something I had never noticed before. It was not fear of rejection alone. It was the exhaustion of someone who had carried the same secret for years while pretending everything was perfectly fine. Mason finally smiled, although it was a quiet and uncertain smile. "You do not have to say anything," he said gently. "I never expected you to feel the same way. I only wanted to stop hiding the truth." I took a slow breath and looked toward the stream, flowing quietly beside us. My mind replayed countless memories from the past decade. I remembered every road trip, every late-night conversation, every birthday, every celebration, and every difficult day when Mason somehow appeared exactly when I needed someone beside me. I remembered the countless times he noticed I was tired before I admitted it, the way he always carried the heavier backpack without mentioning it, and how every adventure somehow felt safer simply because he was there. Then I realized something that surprised even me. I had never once imagined my future without him in it. "Mason," I said quietly, "can I tell you something honestly?" He nodded immediately. "Always." I smiled softly. "When you started talking, I thought I was supposed to feel shocked." I laughed to myself. Instead, I kept remembering how peaceful I have always felt whenever you were around. Mason listened without interrupting. "I have spent years trying to meet someone who made me feel understood," I continued. "But the person who understood me best was standing beside me the entire time." His eyes widened slightly. "Ethan?" I shook my head with a small smile. "I do not know exactly when my feelings changed. Maybe they never really changed at all. Maybe I simply never gave myself enough time to understand them." Mason looked at me as though he wanted to be certain he had heard correctly. "Are you saying?" "I am saying that when I imagined finally getting out of this forest, the first thing I wanted was not my apartment or my office." I laughed gently. "I wanted another hiking trip with you, except maybe one where we actually stayed on the trail." Mason laughed for the first time since his confession, and the tension between us quietly disappeared. "That sounds much better," he admitted, "especially if we remember the map this time." "We did bring the map," I reminded him. "Following it was the difficult part." We both laughed together, the sound echoing softly through the trees. It felt strangely comforting that even after such an important conversation, we could still joke the way we always had. That simple familiarity reassured me that we had not lost our friendship. Instead, we had finally built upon it. As the afternoon continued, we gathered our supplies and returned to the trail markers we had discovered earlier. We carefully followed the signs, encouraging one another whenever the path became uncertain. Nothing about our teamwork changed because it had always worked naturally. The only difference was that every shared glance carried a new understanding neither of us needed to explain. Near sunset, we climbed a gentle ridge where the trees opened just enough to reveal distant mountains stretching across the horizon. Mason stood beside me, smiling quietly at the view. "Whatever happens after we leave here," he said, "thank you for listening." I looked at him with complete certainty. "Thank you for finally telling me." For the first time since we entered the forest, I realized we were no longer searching only for the right path home. We had already found something much more important by choosing complete honesty with each other, and somehow that made every step forward feel lighter than any we had taken before. The following morning greeted us with clear blue skies and crisp mountain air. After days beneath dense trees and winding trails, the sunlight felt brighter than I remembered. Mason folded our small camping shelter while I packed the remaining supplies into our backpacks. Neither of us mentioned the conversation from the previous afternoon, not because it no longer mattered, but because neither of us felt the need to question it anymore. The honesty we had shared seemed to settle naturally between us, as comfortable as every conversation we had enjoyed over the past 10 years. We continued following the marked trail, carefully checking each sign to make sure we stayed on the correct path. Every step carried a quiet sense of confidence that had been missing before. We were no longer wandering without direction. We knew exactly where we wanted to go, both inside the forest and beyond it. Around mid-morning, Mason suddenly stopped walking and raised his hand. "Listen," he said softly. I held my breath. At first I heard only the breeze moving through the branches. Then another sound slowly reached us. It was faint but unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter engine echoed across the valley. Mason smiled immediately. "Search and rescue," he whispered. We both stepped into a small clearing where the trees opened enough to reveal a wide stretch of sky. The helicopter passed overhead, moving slowly while scanning the forest below. We waved brightly colored jackets above our heads and used the emergency whistle attached to Mason's backpack. The aircraft continued flying for several seconds before gently circling back toward our position. I felt relief wash over me as the helicopter completed another pass above the clearing. "I think they saw us," I said. Mason nodded, but instead of celebrating immediately, he looked around at the forest that had surrounded us for the past several days. "Funny," he said quietly. "A week ago I wanted nothing more than to leave this place." I smiled knowingly. "And now," he laughed softly, "now I think I might actually miss part of it." I understood exactly what he meant. The forest had challenged us, slowed us down, and forced us to face conversations we might have postponed forever if life had remained comfortable. It had never been the destination either of us planned, yet somehow it became the place where everything finally made sense. About 20 minutes later, we reached a wider service trail where 2 park rangers were already walking toward us after receiving our location from the helicopter crew. They greeted us warmly, checked that we were healthy, and explained that several search teams had been looking for us after our families reported that we had not returned on schedule. We thanked them sincerely and followed them toward the rescue vehicle waiting farther down the trail. As we walked, Mason quietly matched his pace to mine, just as he always had. Nothing about that simple gesture had changed, except now I understood exactly why he had always done it. Before climbing into the vehicle, I looked back one last time at the towering trees stretching toward the horizon. "You know," I said with a smile, "we never actually found our own way out." Mason looked at me thoughtfully before answering. "Maybe not." Then he smiled in the familiar way that had always made difficult moments feel lighter. "But I think we found something much more important while we were trying." I nodded without hesitation because I knew he was right. The rescue team had found us that morning, but the most meaningful discovery had happened long before we ever heard the helicopter. It happened the moment 2 lifelong friends finally trusted each other enough to stop hiding behind fear and start walking toward the future together, one honest step at a time. Returning to everyday life felt strangely unfamiliar after everything Mason and I had experienced together. The first few days back in Seattle were filled with conversations with worried family members, relieved friends, and kind park officials who wanted to understand how we had managed to stay safe until the search team reached us. Everyone asked about the forest, the trail, and the rescue, yet no one knew the most important part of the story. The greatest change had nothing to do with getting lost. It had happened quietly between 2 people who had finally stopped pretending that friendship was the only thing connecting them. Life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. I returned to work, Mason went back to his own routine, and from the outside almost everything looked exactly the same as before. We still met for coffee after work, still exchanged messages throughout the day, and still laughed about the same old memories that had followed us for years. Yet every ordinary moment carried a new sense of meaning. When Mason smiled at me across a table, I no longer wondered whether I had imagined the warmth in his eyes. When I reached for my coffee, he still remembered exactly how I liked it without asking. Those little habits had always existed. The only difference was that we finally understood why they mattered so much. One Saturday morning, several weeks after returning home, Mason invited me to walk through a large city park instead of spending another afternoon indoors. The weather was bright, families filled the walking paths, children played near the lake, and everything felt wonderfully ordinary. As we walked beneath rows of tall trees, I noticed myself smiling at the familiar sound of leaves moving gently above us. Mason laughed when he caught me looking toward the trees. "You are checking to make sure we are still on the trail, are you not?" I smiled. "Maybe just a little." He pointed toward the clearly marked path ahead. "This time I think we are safe." We both laughed, and the sound carried easily through the warm afternoon air. After a while, we found an empty bench overlooking the water. We sat quietly for several minutes, watching ducks glide across the lake while the city continued peacefully around us. Finally, Mason broke the comfortable silence. "I was worried everything would feel awkward after we came home." I turned toward him. "Does it?" He thought for a moment before shaking his head.
No.
Somehow it feels more natural than before. I nodded because I felt exactly the same way. Nothing about our friendship had disappeared. Instead, honesty had made it stronger. We still teased each other about small mistakes, still finished each other's sentences, and still enjoyed comfortable silence without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. The only real difference was that we no longer hid behind uncertainty. Before leaving the park, we stopped beside a wooden bridge crossing a quiet stream. The gentle sound of flowing water immediately reminded us of the forest. Mason looked at me with the same calm expression I had trusted for nearly a decade. I spent years believing that telling the truth would make me lose the most important person in my life, he admitted. Instead, it gave me the chance to know you even better. I smiled warmly. And I spent years searching for the right person without realizing that the person who understood me best had already been walking beside me. We continued across the bridge together, not rushing toward the future and not looking back with regret. The forest had changed our lives forever, but the greatest lesson it left behind was wonderfully simple. Sometimes the longest journey is not the distance between two places. Sometimes it is the distance between what people feel in their hearts and finally finding the courage to say those feelings out loud. 1 year passed more quickly than either of us expected. The routines of everyday life returned. The headlines about the missing hikers faded away, and the forest slowly became a memory that lived quietly between Mason and me. Yet every important part of our lives had grown from those few unexpected days beneath the tall evergreen trees. We still lived in Seattle, still met friends for dinner, still worked hard during the week, and still found excuses to spend weekends exploring new places together. The difference was wonderfully simple. We no longer wondered how the other person felt. We no longer wasted time hiding behind uncertainty. On the anniversary of our hiking trip, Mason smiled over breakfast and placed a familiar folded map on the table. "One more adventure?" he asked. I laughed immediately. "Only if we promise to stay on the trail this time." He grinned. "That sounds like a very reasonable plan." Later that morning we returned to the same national forest where everything had changed. The weather was almost identical to the day we first arrived together. Cool air drifted through the trees, sunlight filtered gently across the path, and the peaceful sound of birds echoed through the quiet woods. This time, however, we walked with confidence instead of uncertainty. Every trail marker reminded us how far we had come, not only across the forest but through our own lives. After hiking for several hours, we reached the small clearing beside the stream where we had spent one unforgettable evening talking beneath the stars. The place looked almost exactly as we remembered it. The water still flowed gently across smooth stones, and the towering trees still surrounded the clearing with quiet strength. We sat together on the same fallen log where Mason had finally found the courage to speak honestly. Neither of us needed to fill the silence because the silence itself had become one of our favorite conversations. After a while, Mason looked around the clearing and smiled. "I used to think this was the place where we got lost." I looked toward the peaceful stream before answering. "Now I think this is where we finally found the right direction." He nodded, thoughtfully. Funny how life works sometimes. We stayed there until the afternoon sunlight painted long golden shadows across the forest floor. Before leaving, Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden compass that he had carefully restored by hand. On the back he had engraved a simple sentence. "Home was never a place. It was always you." I looked at the compass for several quiet seconds before smiling with grateful disbelief. "I do not think anyone has ever given me a better gift." Mason laughed softly. It seemed more meaningful than another coffee mug. We both laughed together, just as we always had. As we walked back along the clearly marked trail, I realized the forest no longer represented fear or uncertainty. It represented honesty, courage, patience, and the quiet decision to stop running from feelings that had always been there. Looking back, I understood that we had never truly been lost. We simply needed enough distance from ordinary life to recognize what had been standing beside us all along. Sometimes people spend years searching for happiness in distant places, believing that the answer must be somewhere new. Our story taught me something very different. The greatest discoveries are often waiting inside the relationships we already treasure, hidden beneath ordinary moments until the day we finally choose honesty over fear. As Mason and I reached the trailhead together, I smiled because I knew our greatest adventure had never been surviving the forest. It had been finding the courage to walk into the future side by side, grateful that the longest journey of our lives had led us home to each other.